Welcome to Breakdancing with Jesus. Nah, I'm just kidding. This is Building the Things. My name's Jesus, and we're gonna build this pretty cool looking 8-foot long table that is 33 inches wide and 30 inches tall. So, pretty standard dining room table. The one thing that is not standard though is that the top is completely separate from the legs, as in, if you ever need to move it, you just lift up the top and then you move it. So I'm gonna show you what I did. If you don't wanna do what I did, then don't do what I did. If you do, then cool. And if you wanna see an update in the future, like maybe a year from now or something, let me know in the comments and then I'll remember, or hopefully remember, to do a follow-up video. So cool, let's get to work. So to start everything off, first thing I did is I grabbed all my pieces of lumber. I made sure I put the pieces that fit the best together, basically just the flattest. These are dimensional lumber. They're Douglas fir. They are 2 by 12 by 8. So as you can see, there's gaps in there. So I'm gonna have to address all that. But like I said, this is a rustic type build. So it doesn't have to be perfectly perfect. As a matter of fact, if it's perfectly perfect, it won't look rustic. So all I did is I labeled the pieces. I made sure that I flipped them over and I labeled the backside. That way, when I'm ripping them down my table saw, I know to keep the ups up and the down down. And that way, when I glue them together, it all comes together seamlessly. So then I just measured for square, and they were slightly off, which is perfect because as I rotate them, when they come together, that seam's gonna fit a little bit like a mirror. So then I didn't have clamps that were long enough for this table. And instead of buying some for something I'm not really gonna do that often, I made these primitive clamps, at least I call them that. And they're basically just 2x4s screwed together. And when you tighten them towards you, they squeeze, creating clamping power. That's it. So then I just put a bunch of glue, no big deal. But I didn't put a ton of glue because I didn't want to have a ton of glue squeeze out. So I made sure I just put just enough that I get a little bit of squeeze out, but not enough that it's just dripping everywhere. And you'll see how I will clean the glue squeeze out because there is a little bit. Anywho, so then I just grabbed my primitive clamps, clamped it together by pulling it towards myself. And I'm also going to add a tie down strap or ratchet tie down, whatever you call it. That's just going to help keep it together. I knew I was going to be doing stuff for the next couple days and I probably wouldn't see the table for a little bit. So I just slowly tighten everything down, one piece at a time, leaving it snug before giving its final tightness, just to make sure that they are as square as possible. I'm really focused on the top as you're primarily going to see the top and, well, that's where you eat. And for glue squeeze out, I just use baby wipes because they're moist, they're disposable, and then they're readily available to me because I have a kid. Anyway, so then I removed all the clamps from the tabletop, as you see me doing here. Removing the cawls first, and then removing my little primitive clamps. No big deal, it just had to get done. And then here's the moment of truth to decide if my clamping trick worked or not. And of course you gotta be careful with these large tabletops, they are super heavy. And as you see, based on the shaking and the movement and lifting it, I didn't hear any sounds, I didn't hear any cracking. And then I'm looking at my seams, making sure that they're okay, making sure nothing happened, and they were good. So I put it back down, and that's pretty much it. So I started cutting down my legs to a rough dimension, not the final length, so my wife can start working on her design. She wasn't sure if she wanted to do more square or to have like some half lap joinery. So she worked on that while I started to hand plane. So to hand plane, I just used a level. I put it and I scooted it down about 6 to 8 inches at a time. And I just highlighted all the high spots, and those are the spots I'm going to hit first with the plane. And I'm going to repeat this process until it's relatively flat. And I'll get more into that in a second. So I continue that process, and as you see, my sander is out because after every every planing I did, I gave it a quick sand using 60 grit sandpaper just to make sure I can still see everything, put the level back on there, do the same thing, see if any light is shining underneath, and that's it. And there's this little area in the tabletop that it was just horrendous. This little knot there, right there, just made my life that much harder. So I continued working on that, and then I sanded, I planed, and then sanded, I planed, and then sanded. I don't know if that's the right way of doing it, but for me it seems the easiest and the easiest to track. So that's what I did. And then after all that, I made sure I give it the final sand. I like to do hand sanding for the final one, just to make sure that there's no swirl marks. I'm barely putting any pressure on there. Then I flipped it over and started the process again. And as you can see, I'm taking off very little at a time. My hand plane, I set it up to take like a 64th to maybe a 32nd off. It is not taking much off. And I like it that way, so that way I can really dial it in, and then I'll move the plane from one long grain end to the other, just like that. Then once everything was planed, I went ahead and cut my table to its final dimension, which I did 2 passes with the circular saw using painter's tape. That's just to prevent like tear out or any kind of chip out or anything like that. And then I just sanded it. Now, keep in mind, I'm gonna run a router bit through here, a chamfer bit, that's 1/8 of an inch. So I really wasn't concerned about too many things, tearing out or chipping out. So I was just using a 24 tooth blade. It wasn't a big deal. But I really need to get a cordless one because, yeah, cordless routers I think are gonna be the way to go for me. Anyways. So once I did that, I went ahead and just hand sanded everything. That way it looks a little more rustic. It doesn't look all uniform. And then I started working on the legs. My wife said she wanted these rectangular type legs with hidden aprons and removable top. So I just made it happen. So then I cut all my pieces, which were basically 6 pieces that you're gonna screw together. So it wasn't that big of a deal, but we had to get it done somehow. And that was pretty much the end of the legs. And as you see my rudimentary stop block here, it doesn't take a lot to begin woodworking. It just takes some ingenuity and some grit. Anyways, so then I labeled all my legs, making sure that I just labeled them because they weren't all the same thickness. Some were 3.5, some were 3 5/8, and so anyway, I just went ahead and made sure that all the important parts that were going to be inside were the same thickness, so everything could be nice and square. Then, knowing I was going to put screws through these butt joints, because butt joints are not necessarily all that strong, I wanted to make sure that I drilled in an area where I can put some dowels. So I'm just using a 1/2 inch drill bit here, and you're going to see I go down maybe 2 inches, I believe, and that's just going to be enough so I can throw some dowels in there after the screws are in there. And then I'm going to sand it flush to make sure everything's good and kosher. And I really like doing this with I don't know why I like doing this, but I like releasing it into my hand, my tape measure. I don't know, I just think it's so fun. It's like a magic trick. There you go. Then I just labeled everything where all the holes were going to go. That way it's as uniform as possible. But again, it's rustic, so I don't want it to be too perfect. And as you'll see here in a second, that's not going to be too perfect. But anyway, a little bit of a tip here. If you're going to do butt joints, you want to clog the end grain up with some wood glue before you do your final gluing. I don't know if you're familiar with how wood grain looks, but if you're not, no big deal. It is basically a bunch of straws together. So if you just throw some glue on there it won't have enough to clog all the pores. So by adding the glue ahead of time and letting it dry for about 5 minutes, and then adding some more glue, the glue is adhering to the glue, which is already adhered to the inside of the wood fiber. If that doesn't make sense, there's a bunch of videos on YouTube and other sites that go into more detail. And then this little jig here, if you don't have one, they're relatively inexpensive and they just help you make straight holes. So that way your screws aren't all cattywampus. But you see there, they weren't perfectly linear. So before I kept moving on, I went ahead and sanded everything just to its final sanding. So this is getting close to the 220 mark because sanding sucks when everything's together and you don't want to do that anyway. Now, these are going to be painted, so it wasn't that big of a deal. Then I just put the glue, screwed them in, and that was the end of that sad story. And I'm using 3-inch screws here in case you're interested, because that's going to give me enough bite force in my opinion. But if you don't agree, then you don't agree. Anyway, so then I started cutting my aprons. These are going to have miter joints, which is still like an end grain to end grain connection. There's nothing too crazy and fancy about them. So I like to put a sacrificial piece of wood there, and that's going to allow me to line up my lines perfectly. So with all my aprons done, I moved on to the next thing, which is to screw it together. So I pre-drilled some holes, knowing that I'm going to put screws through there. And although the screws I use do not require pre-drilling, I wanted to make sure that everything lined up perfect. So I just took my time, nice and slow, because glue ups are very stressful. And there's nothing like trying to glue up 4 miter joints for 6 foot long pieces of wood with like maybe 3 feet long or 2.5 feet long pieces of wood. It's very stressful, and I don't like to stress out like that. So I glued everything up ahead of time. I let it dry for 5 minutes, added some more glue, and then threw some screws in it. Now I did add this clamp underneath. That's going to do one of two things. First, it's going to allow me to hold it together while I'm drilling it in, as you see there. And 2, I'm going to keep it there, so when I'm doing the other side, once I remove it from clamps, hopefully everything is really square still. And in my case, it was. It doesn't always work out that way, but with some trial and error, you kind of get the hang of it. And I did the same thing for the other side, which is why you see that clamp there. It's no big deal. Now, I'm not sponsored by Ryobi, but for a beginner woodworker who does some home projects here and there, even myself that I do a little bit more woodworking maybe than you do, they're perfect. They won't give you any problems. So then I lined up where my table legs were going to go. I gave myself a spacer using a combination square just so everything was perfect. And this is the internet anyway, so if I tell you it's perfect and you can't really tell from this distance anyway, you're gonna assume it's perfect. So don't beat yourself up if things don't look exactly perfect, because my table definitely wasn't perfect. I can see all my mistakes. I don't know if you can spot them out. Anyway, so then I removed the legs from the apron, and I'm just gonna add a little bit of glue to make sure that everything sticks together. And in this case, I'm gonna drive some screws through there on the inside, just so you're not seeing a ton of screws everywhere, and that way that 2x4 is secure to the table leg, and that's going to be pretty much it. I'm just going to make sure everything is nice, snug, and fitting perfectly. So yeah, make sure you get a lot of glue in there, but not too much that you have a ton of squeeze out, because squeeze out is no fun. Anyway, these are pretty snug, so I lined them up, put them to where my pencil markings were, and then you're going to see I'm going to give a little tap, tap, tap with my little hammer just to make sure everything is flat. Then I'll drive the screws. Oh, look, there I am. I'm tapping with my hammer, just like I said I would. Yep, get all the little edges. Those are all the edges that are going to touch the tabletop. And then I drove in those screws. No big deal. as one woodworker I watched on YouTube says, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. And it's not a big deal. So these are also 3-inch screws, so I don't have to buy a bunch of screws. Then I'm just gonna add this last little stretcher here, and basically I'm just gonna stretch it down, cut it down, place it in there, add some glue. I'm not gonna do the preemptive glue because this is gonna take screws anyway, and this is pretty much straight into the grain, so it was no big deal. I just place it into my aprons, make sure it's nice and square, and then I'm gonna drive in some more 3-inch screws, which is probably overkill. You'd probably get away with 2-inch screws, but I'm not gonna countersink them. These are gonna be flush to the wood, so less things to worry about in my opinion, but you could do whatever you want to do. It's your world. I just live in it. So anyway, I drive in my screws just a little bit. There is nothing more frustrating than trying to drive in your screws as your wood is drying with your glue, and you're just trying to get everything square, and then things stop being square and you're just back and forth. All right guys, so we're at the point of the video where I'm going to show you what I did to make the tabletop removable. But instead of just showing you, let me try to explain it, and hopefully that makes more sense than just you seeing me glue and then brad nail something into place. But first things first, I didn't use screws because brad nails and glue are very strong. So no matter how early you are into your woodworking career or your woodworking hobby, if you brad nail and glue something, glue is stronger than the wood grain. You know, there's a bunch of videos on YouTube explaining that if you don't already have that knowledge. But if you do, then cool. We can move on to the next thing. Let's talk about the wood movement. Wood moves side to side, as in it expands and contracts as moisture builds inside of it. Hence why boards are always exactly the same length, but they do shift over time width-wise, and they bow and they cup and they do all that stuff that wood just normally does. So the two ways to defeat that is I gave myself 1/8 of an inch on either side, and I gave myself a super snug fit lengthwise. There's a 2x4 that I'm going to show you, and that's all I did. So talking about that 2x4 that I wanted to show you, you can see it here. It's just a regular 2x4. I cut it to 3 inches in width, and I just gave myself a little wiggle room to make sure that when seasonal wood movement happens, it does it seamlessly. Anyway, so talking about wood grain and why wood glue is stronger than the lignin that connects the wood fibers together, which is the cellulose. If you're not aware, wood glue now, at least with current research, I don't know how things are going to look 100 years from now, but with current research, it showed that it is stronger. So when you glue things together with wood glue, if you go long grain to long grain, if you were to smack it with a hammer, typically the wood will split at one of the fibers of the wood and not the wood glue. So that's what I mean by wood glue is stronger than wood grain. It's just easier layman terms, but the lignin is what is actually stronger than. Anyway, so here I am adding my removable top component, which is basically a stretcher inside the apron that's hidden. I add some glue, I add some brad nails, and I'll do like a little bit of a surface brad nail first, just to make sure things don't move. And then I'm really gonna pump up the brad nailer and drive them all the way in. These are 2-inch nails, so worst case scenario, if one were to pop out, it'd be very small, and none of them popped out, thankfully. Anyway, so what you did to one side, you got to do to the other side. Here I am freaking out about not knocking anything over because I was too excited to keep working and didn't really think about all the stuff behind me. But anyway, there I am struggling for your viewing pleasure. Thankfully, nothing fell, and we can keep moving on with our lives, which in this case is finishing this table. Anywho, So I just made sure all my joints are strong. This was like an hour after I had glued everything together. So I wanted to make sure I can hold my weight. I weigh roughly 240 pounds on a good day. So yeah, there I am telling you that I weigh 240 pounds. So I got on top of it and I didn't hear anything. I didn't feel anything. Now granted, I'm wearing headphones, but got my dance groove on there and I didn't fall onto the ground. So then a little bit later, after I took a lunch break, I was like, well, I'm a little heavier now. Let me get back on this thing and see what happens. And I danced on it. I pretended to be a superhero of sorts. I don't know. It held up just fine. So then my wife was very lovely and helped me bring out the table so we can make sure that I can sand it down to its final dimensions for the stretchers and the little removable top components. And as you see here, it is very snug. As a matter of fact, it was so snug that one of the little pieces or one of the little edges wasn't able to sit down properly. But that's okay, because that's why you don't screw everything down right away. So you see me struggling here. Eventually we realized, you know what, maybe it's so snug that we gotta reevaluate this thing. But at this point, everything's already glued in place and nailed together, so all we can do is chamfer and sand, which is what I did. We remove the top then, we go back inside, and it's time to go back to the drawing board. So all I did was I added a 1/8 chamfer all around the stretchers there, and I just sanded a little bit off just to give myself a little more wiggle room, lengthwise, but not widthwise. Then I just cut some dowels using a flush trim saw because I was too lazy to use a miter saw, and honestly with those little pieces, just better safe than sorry. Nothing wrong with a little handsaw action. So then I just put glue all over these dowel holes, and I like to make sure that it gets in there, hence why I stick my finger in it. So I rub it all down, I stick it in there, and then I pretend it's whack-a-mole, and I just start whacking it in place. Now, you are going to get a little squeeze out. That's okay. You're going to sand things down anyway, so there you go. So in order to give myself the best fit that I can, I like to add a little piece of wood there just to give myself a little bit of space. That is what I like to do. It doesn't mean that that's what you have to do, but I think I like just the way it looks better. Now, in this case, this was a little dangerous because I'm cutting towards myself, and thankfully I had another dowel there to catch that blade. But if you don't, make sure you cut away from you, which is what I ended up doing once I realized, yeah, I should probably cut away from me. And you're going to see here in a second that, yep, it gives you a little bit of an edge, but that's okay because you're going to sand it down for your final sanding anyway, which is where you're going to see me do here in a second. And there I am doing it. So once that's nice and flush, then you're good to go. And these are going to get painted, so you're not going to see that end grain. But if you were going to see that end grain, I would do a different species of wood, maybe like a walnut or something a little darker, like maybe a purple heart or something, just so it gives you a nice contrast. But knowing these are going to get painted black, I figured, well, that's the point. So as far as finishing goes, I use this polyurethane that's labeled triple thick. And when I say thick, it was pretty thick. So first thing I'm going to do on my first coat is I'm going to make sure I put plenty of this polyurethane in all of my knots. One, it's going to help seal them to prevent moisture. And two, it's going to kind of self-level out. So that way it kind of just looks a little better. It doesn't look so rough. But I like to use the water-based one, even though it's meant for interior instead of exterior, because it doesn't amber the wood as much, but it still allows the grain to pop. So that's what I did, and I'm really focused on the knots. And then once I'm done with the knots, then I'll focus on the entirety of the table. which is what you're going to see here in a second. And there it is, all finished up. I worked until the nighttime, and no, I'm not crazy. I didn't leave it outside to dry. I brought it back inside, but we just had to be careful because the top was finished. Then my brother volunteered, aka was voluntold. He needed to help me sand. So shout out to my mom for having my brother sand my table for me, because I hate sanding. I'm just kidding. He actually likes to help me do stuff, and this is one of the things that he likes to do. He's very meticulous, and he really takes his time. I would have just breezed right through it and moved on with my life. So while he was sanding, I started working on this nasty little knot that I didn't feel like I can seal, and I thought maybe it can go a little deeper, and I was right. It did go deeper, so I just took it out. It was basically like part of the bark, and I just try to give it a little concaveness to it, and it took a while, but I used this rotary tool, which if you don't have one, hand sanding would be fine, but I just wanted to give it a nice curve, which is what I did. So then I started to finish the bottom using the same polyurethane thickness with the triple thick, and that's all I did. There was nothing fancy to it. I did 3 coats, and between each coat I would sand to 220. And now here the table is, looking nice and fresh on the inside, and my lovely wife decorated it to look really cool. At least in our opinion, really cool. If you have a different opinion, it's probably because your opinion sucks. Well, anyways, thanks for coming to watch my video. Feel free to subscribe and tag along for the other stuff. We have a lot of projects coming up, and it'd be cool if you were there for them.